Live and direct, live and I take no jive. Legalize it.
So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, and welcome back. It's another episode of the Karma Koala podcast. We're off to New Mexico today, which is one of my favorite places in the US. I haven't been there for a very, very long time, but all the people there always seem far more normal than some of the other parts of the US, to be honest. And I'm speaking to a psychedelics lawyer. She also practices a bit of cannabis law, Victoria Cvitanovic, and I knew I was going to pronounce it wrong as soon as it came out of my mouth. She's just joined Ruddick Law, who have been practicing in cannabis and psychedelics for quite a while now. And she's going to talk to us about her practice in psychedelics, medicine law, and how she got there, basically. Victoria, welcome to the show. I knew, and although in the preamble I got you to pronounce your name properly, the first thing I was going to do was pronounce it wrong, so my apologies.
Thank you so much for having me. Like I said when we were talking before, I had to learn it myself when I got married. My last name is Cvitanovic.
Cvitanovic.
So good.
Cvitanovic. Yeah, it's not designed, not designed for my tongue, I don't think. Anyway, we'll get off that straight away. Psychedelics law. What led you to psychedelics law? What sort of practice, when you came out of law school, did you think, oh, I want to work in psychedelics or cannabis? But I presume you got waylaid and had to do the normal, either some, corporate law stuff or conveyancing or really exciting stuff like that.
Sean, I'll tell you, I had a journey in law that I could have never planned and I could never replicate if I wanted to. When I came out of law school, I was actually a narcotics prosecutor in New Orleans, Louisiana. I focused my career
that sounds like a Netflix series before, just with the one sentence.
Yes, I was a baby prosecutor, and my career was really focused on the structure of drug crime indictments. I was doing a lot of screening drug cases, figuring out how those things were charged, as well as prosecuting a felony court docket. It was really disheartening.
I was about to say, well, if you're in New Orleans, that's about one of the most disheartening places you could be doing that work, isn't it?
And I love New Orleans. New Orleans
Yeah.
is full of so many beautiful people and so much beautiful culture, but there are long-lasting intrinsic problems that happen in that city around poverty and access to healthcare that lead to some really difficult outcomes and end up with people being justice involved. After prosecution, I was really devastated by the number of people that I had seen who were patients that became dependent on the illicit drug market and became criminalized as a result of their health conditions. And so when I left, I was like, I want to learn everything about healthcare law. So I started working in medical malpractice defense first, and then healthcare transactional law, compliance, things like that. And then slowly but surely, my two paths started to converge, and I didn't know that it was going to happen. I was at the gym one day. I used to do aerial silks as a stress relieving activity, keep a little bit of art in my life. And I fell at the gym and I broke part of the vertebrae in my back. I squished a bunch of discs in between them. And for 8 months after that, I couldn't walk on my own.
And did they put you on the opiates as well? Is that and so you sort of got a bit of a sense of the sort of people that you'd been dealing with before who had been walked down a path that they weren't aware of?
So opiates didn't work for me. I was one of those people that got so extremely nauseous that I couldn't take anything for my pain. And so I was left with this really long path in front of me of being 29 years old at the time that I got hurt, in severe pain, unable to really take anything for it, and not sure of what I was going to do. I practice Zen Buddhism and have really committed to that kind of very sober, very aware lifestyle. So I was also very hesitant to try anything outside of the norm for my pain, for fear of compromising my principles or not being as committed to that awareness as I wanted to be. And so when one of my clients, one of my med mal defense clients came to me and said, "You're a perfect candidate for psychedelic assisted therapy," I laughed at her.
Yeah.
It's like, what are you talking about? I used to be a drug prosecutor. I'm a Buddhist. I'm so committed to this sober lifestyle. How could I ever do psychedelics? And she actually called my priest and told him, "You have to talk to her. You know, she's suffering and she doesn't have to be." And so my priest came to me and he asked me a question that changed the course of my life. And that was, do you think that people do psychedelic therapy for connection or for disassociation? And when he said that,
It
it all
clicked. It clicked
clicked.
immediately.
It all clicked for me.
Mm.
All of these people hadn't gone out of their way to help me get high and run away from my problems. They had gone out of their way to help pull me back into the community and help bear some of the pain that I was holding that was just too much for me after this accident. And so after that conversation, I decided to try it. I had my first ketamine session. And when I came out of the session, my doctor came in to chat with me. And I remember I took both of her hands and said, "You have to let me look at your insurance. I have to make sure that this doesn't go away." And so I started with her. And from then on, I've been trying to help practitioners, providers in the space, patients, and producers in the space as well work safely with as little risk as possible to really give us a chance of having this movement keep going and grow.
So this was before you joined Ruddick. This was just your own solo practice that you were doing from home and building.
So at the time that this happened to me, I was actually working for a regional law firm in New Orleans. It was a very traditional, very kind of white shoe, very Southern law firm. And so when this happened and I started down this path, I knew that eventually this wasn't going to be the right place for me.
Yeah.
I ended up at Wilson Elser, one of the largest insurance defense firms in the US. It was a great place for starting to build this momentum and learning this practice area. But ultimately, I needed to be surrounded by people who live and breathe this, who are the real experts in the field. And so when I met Lauren Ruddick and we started talking, I realized that she and I were of the same kind of person. We were so dedicated to this space that we were doing all the extra reading and research without even a reason to, without a client to bill it to. This was our lives, not just our practice. And when I found that connection and then met the rest of her team, I knew these were the right people for that next step. And so now I'm here.
So did that create a physical move to New Mexico as well? I mean, you're thinking, I mean, it's an obvious place to live, but that's how all the paths converge, so to speak.
So I actually moved to New Mexico about a year before I joined Ruddick.
Mhm.
I was getting really concerned about access to healthcare in Louisiana. I went through a very minor, very early caught cervical cancer incident. And so when that happened, women's healthcare became not just important to me as a person, but important to me for my survival going forward and for a good outcome coming forward. So when my husband and I started thinking about moving, New Mexico was this very obvious place where we had a lot of emphasis on adequate women's health care, really beautiful, kind people who we could build community with. And we had this history of the psychedelics movement in Taos and the current psychedelics movement that's led to the New Mexico Medical Psilocybin Act. It was just the perfect place for my
Well, that was
family.
that was going to be my next question. So you're obviously aware of politically what's happening in New Mexico, and you could see, opportunity is well, it's the right and the wrong word at the same time when we're talking about the psychedelics. But you could see that it was a place that you could create and build on that conversation and work with all parts of society or community to understand how psychedelics can be part of the legislated environment, regulated environment. Yes.
Absolutely. New Mexico has a really beautiful network of people who are working in the space with ketamine. And then when the New Mexico Psilocybin Act ended up being presented to the legislature, when I went to the Roundhouse and saw how people were talking about this, it was clear that people here take psychedelics as medicine very seriously and take the survival and growth of this state very seriously. When I went to the legislature to speak on behalf of the Medical Psilocybin Act, I spoke with both Republican and Democrat representatives and senators, and everyone was equally supportive of the idea that we have a tool for this burgeoning mental health crisis. And it is our responsibility as citizens of this state to all of our brothers and sisters that are suffering to make this accessible.
So, I mean, before we get into some of the details, because I'd like to know some of the details about New Mexico, I just wanted to touch on, in New Mexico, which is liberal but conservative at the same time, like a lot of, that part of the country. Are you finding in the current political climate that there's a level of common sense in the state that you live in that allows for a conversation to move forward? I just wanted to ask that question before we move into the practicalities of what's happening in New Mexico, because I think it's really, really important in the States at the moment, because I do see a war on drugs approaching over the horizon very quickly. And of course, it starts with, bad people overseas doing bad things with cocaine without any discussion of where the market is for that cocaine. And I'm already beginning to see little hints of that, this new politically generated war on drugs beginning to spread to other compounds and substances. And at some point, cannabis and psychedelics are going to get caught up in this. People are sort of denying it to themselves at the moment. And I think it's really important to speak to people like yourself in certain states to understand the political desire not to get caught up in that once again, because it's just going back 50 years.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. We are seeing a shift in American drug policy that is very scary for those of us who work in the field. I will say this, though. New Mexico only had 12 legislators, House and Senate combined, that voted against the Medical Psilocybin Act. We saw a tremendous amount of support. This wasn't just a win, it was a landslide. When we went through committees, we only saw 3 total committee members out of the 5 committees that this went through vote against the bill. Excuse me, the 4 committees that this went through vote against the bill. It was truly amazing to see how much research people had done, how much work people put into being informed, and how regular everyday New Mexicans had shown up to talk to their legislators about what they wanted to see for the future of medical psilocybin. We had veterans groups, we had providers, we had lawyers, we had the owners of private foundations, all there in person on a work day, walking around and stopping their legislators in the hallway and saying, "Hey, I want to talk to you about psilocybin." And they were listening. I don't know of many places in America right now where you could walk up to a legislator on either side of the aisle, no matter which side you affiliate with, and have a sensible conversation with them about
Well,
the benefits of
there's 4
psilocybin.
states, aren't there? Basically,
Yes,
there's
and it
yourself, there's
happened.
Oregon, there's Washington, there's Colorado, and not even in California are you going to be having those conversations, even though the history of psychedelics is as storied there as it is in your part of the world.
Absolutely. It was truly amazing to see everyone come together. And I think in New Mexico in particular, the veterans movement that we have here that really take veterans' health seriously and have built a tight coalition of people who are looking out for each other was essential in this movement coming to the point that it is now.
So where are we now, and what can you do in New Mexico? And is it only available for people who are resident in the state, or people who are not resident in the state? Can they also access healthcare?
Yeah, so nothing's available yet. This act has been voted through the House and the Senate. We're waiting on the governor's signature. Right now, most people are incredibly optimistic about receiving that signature. Once the act is signed into law, what we'll see happen first is that the Department of Health will appoint a 9-member medical psilocybin advisory board, similar to the advisory board that exists in Oregon.
Yeah.
Once those members are appointed, they are going to start the rulemaking process to promulgate the rules for producers and for providers who want to be involved in the program. Once those rules are promulgated, it is expected that the program will officially begin on or before December 31st of 2027, and that the first patients will receive their doses in March of 2028. This is a slow program, which I know is not everyone's ideal. But what I'm excited about is that unlike some of the other markets we've seen, we're going to have a chance to ask our questions and to get compliant for day one. We're not going to have to make mistakes and have lawsuits in order to be rule following. Our providers can start safe.
And will the system be fairly similar to the Oregon or Colorado setup with, a limited number of providers? And are they going to be split in their specialities? Do we know any of the answers to these questions yet?
So we don't know yet what the licensing scheme is going to look like. Once this 9-member board is empowered to start promulgating their rules, we'll know if there are going to be numerical caps on the licenses. When I was speaking to the people who've advocated for this bill and to the Department of Health, what they indicated to me was that the point is equal access. The New Mexico Psilocybin Act actually has written into it an equity fund to help people who can't afford to pay for this treatment because it is going to be out of pocket, pay for it. And it's required that one of the board members be someone who is advocating for community equity, and that someone else on the board be a registered member of a tribe, nation, or pueblo that's located wholly or in part within New Mexico. So we have a lot of emphasis here on spreading out equal access. And I think that will have an effect on whether or not we see license caps and things like that.
Now, here's another question. I've spoken to a number of licensed, therapy providers, mainly obviously in Oregon and Colorado. And one thing I've noticed with these people is they're very highly educated people. There's this perception outside that, they might, if they dress a little bit hippie, they're a bit, but they're some of the most highly educated people I've ever spoken to. But what's interesting is the regulation is getting ahead of education in terms of formalized education for psilocybin, ketamine, and other psychedelic compound treatment. Is that anything about that written into the legislation? Because that's one thing I haven't seen in the country yet, is you've got these very highly educated people, but they haven't been able to formulate a specific education in what they do going forward, because then people like you, in terms of medical insurance and all these other issues, those are the issues that are going to cause problems in the courts further down the line. I mean, what's your knowledge of this and what you're thinking about this?
So we're very lucky in that we already have some colleges within the state. I'm thinking specifically of Southwestern College that offer psychedelics-based curriculum. We are starting to see an educational movement that has started in the colleges and spreading throughout the general population to get people informed as to how these things work. The educational requirements for providers haven't been set yet. And it's going to be very interesting to see what they are, because one of the other board members is required to be someone who's already licensed to provide behavioral health services within the state. And people have indicated that they will be looking to that board member to say, what does a provider need to know and how do they need to be educated before they start working within this field? You're right in that the standard of care that we see right now for other psychedelics like ketamine is fairly varied throughout the United States. And even though US law recognizes the idea that standard of care must be dependent on a geographic location, based around what other providers are doing in your area, what is the standard, we're not actually seeing geographic variance as much as we're seeing clinic to clinic variance.
Yeah, well, that's I mean, especially with ketamine, that it's more so than anything else, and that that if that becomes a problem, it provides ammunition for the wrong people to start goes back to that conversation about the new war on drugs that's looming on the horizon, whether we like it or not, and it's getting that balance right, isn't it?
Exactly. And I think that's why, despite the fact that all of us want access now, access today, we have advocated for this bill that has this intentionally slow rollout. We're going to know who these people are that are making rules about this. And as they're promulgated, the Department of Health is going to have time to address feedback and commentary from the public on what is missing from these rules. I think you're going to see a very loud voice of New Mexicans saying, we want to know what the dosage looks like, what the treatment protocol looks like, et cetera, before this opens. And it is written into the bill that the board will promulgate rules that are that specific. And I think that's going to be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, very important indeed. Look, we could carry on talking about the details of what will happen. But a question that I have when I speak to people who've moved into law and psychedelics is, obviously you're dealing with clients who deal in, trying to provide psychedelic services over a period of time. But I'm more interested also in the idea that the concept of psychedelics within the legal system and how that begins to influence and hopefully change the legal system. And all the other lawyers I've spoken to have been very strong on this point, that the one of the reasons they did it is because not just because they want to help people be able to provide therapeutic services to other people, but they also want psychedelics to start informing the way that law is done in the US. And it's a very, very, we're talking under 100 people. It's a very nascent set of thinking. And obviously, it's not, as you say, you worked at a white shoe law firm down in New Orleans. It's going to be a long time before that culture sort of gets into there. But how are you thinking about what psychedelics will mean for the way that some lawyers initially, but law itself can start thinking about itself in the US? Is that something that's high in your mind when you decided to move into this area?
Absolutely. Psychedelics have already changed everything about the way that I practice law. They have helped me start prioritizing how I can schedule myself and how I can work with my clients to provide more community services. They've helped me start to think about long-term, how am I going to invest in my community? What is it that I can give? What are the services that I can provide? How can I structure my rates so that I'm able to give back more and invest in those people who are never going to be huge revenue generators, but are huge culture generators? I think what psychedelics are going to do for the practice of law overall, and this may take, 100 years, is they're going to force us to think about the fact that we are human beings first, all walking hand to hand together on this planet, who are essentially beings that are here to learn the work of compassion. And we are going to have to bring that into the way that we handle conflict. Lawyers are good at conflict. We're really good at staying cool under pressure, not resorting to yelling or name calling, but we're not good at taking that next step and seeing our adversary as a whole, complete person. But when we inject the psychedelic community mindset beyond the substances, the entire culture, into the way that we practice law, we have to reckon with the other side's humanity in an incredibly visceral way. And I think you can't emerge from an interaction like that with another human without being changed.
So they train you at law school at the moment, not really to think too much on that. And maybe in first year, there's a couple of, nicey-feely courses that a few people take. But by year three, you're down. So how is the first stage for that? I mean, I'm just sort of, talking and investigating at the same time, is how do we engage with law schools to start thinking more seriously about, I've been looking at this with regard to cannabis. So, at the moment, if there's cannabis law, it's sort of like separate from the rest of the law school. It's
Right.
not built, into it, which is, entirely the wrong approach. It should start being, when you come in, maybe over for the next 10 years, it is only part of a first year course, but everybody has to learn some element of how that part of the industry has developed over the last 10 years, because it explains a whole range of things, like how these compounds come into law now. It's the 21st century. You're going to be seeing more of it, and psychedelics is the same. How do we get to law school deans and say, we need to start incorporating this rather than perceiving it as something separate, so that when they come out of law school, whatever law they choose to, they at least have that knowledge, even if it's only like a 5% part of their knowledge base, to start thinking about the way that they practice law. Yeah, I always use conveyancing, even if they're just doing conveyancing.
I think that comes from an integration of the reality of law student mental health into the discussion. When I was going to law school, we had just started talking about the fact that law school wasn't good for you mentally, that learning how to look for risk
That's
makes
a
you a
fact.
professional. Yes, it
Anybody
makes
else,
you
anybody else at the university is not going to be talking to law students because
yeah.
they're all mad.
Yeah, but we all started realizing that teaching people to look for risk makes them a professional pessimist, and that always looking for things that can go wrong has a detrimental effect on your mental health. Now we're really starting to see law schools take some responsibility for that and say, these are young people that have entrusted their futures to us. We're going to help build out this robust mental health program. When we talk about psychedelics and community and the reason why these substances are so important, it all comes back to this planet, this life that we're living can be stressful and hard, and we have tools to help you connect, to love, and to trust, and to move past your depression. If we start talking about the mental health crisis more clearly in law schools, we're necessarily going to be talking about the tools that people use to overcome these hardships that we all deal with and how we connect to community. I think psychedelics are a very natural part of that conversation, especially as states start becoming more comfortable with the idea of the medical model. I think we could debate all day as to whether or not the medical model is the best solution for incorporating psychedelics into our community.
Yeah, well, I haven't even started having that conversation with people because I come from a background where we all use psychedelics for pleasure and for recreation, as they like to say. And to be honest, I don't see the difference.
Right.
I had to grow up in a time where it was illegal during the 80s in England. And we grew up in a culture that created a whole new set of music and all this sort of stuff, and that we built a community that is now just part of global life. My generation in the UK, and I'm having these conversations the whole time, and that part of it, people are a bit scared to talk about the fact that fun is a bit like cannabis. The fun part of it you can't really talk about because those people in power, that's what they use to control. Is that if you're having too much fun, it's got to be bad for you.
Right. And I think that that is a conversation that's going to keep developing. But the fact that we've gotten legislators onto the idea that this can be therapeutic and helpful is a great place to start.
Yeah.
As the body of research builds and we start to have more and more clear evidence of the ways in which psychedelics can positively impact human beings, that mental health conversation that's growing in law schools right now is going to have to incorporate the tools that we have to fight that crisis. And I think that is how we're going to start to see the conversation about psychedelics happen at law schools around the country and hopefully around the world.
And we haven't got long to run. So what are you hoping for your practice this year, just this year? Because I think it's going to, I think these things are going to actually move a lot faster. You've got those other forces, but I have for some reason, I always find this a bit, people seem to be more positive about getting psychedelics legislation through houses than they are with cannabis, which I just find a little bit bizarre because I'm also a literature grad. So my background is, I grew up reading all your Keys's, your Huxleys and everything. And one thing that in the continual optimism of the US is that worries me is the fact that